On BBC Two, a movie landmark from John Fowles' acclaimed novel, The French Lieutenant's Woman. One woman in two love stories, one before the camera and one behind the scenes.
Come back!
Jeremy Irons and Meryl Streep in Harold Pinter's award-winning screenplay of a woman who wanted her freedom too soon.
Rowan Atkinson, Griff Rhys-Jones, Helen Lederer, Simon Bates and Sue Cook are amongst those serving up some sound and entertaining advice on drink in Psst, the really useful guide to alcohol, on BBC One in 25 minutes. Viewers in Northern Ireland will see it at 11:35. The most famous painting by Russian artist Malevich is of a simple black square, but what does it mean? The Late Show tonight sets out for his exhibition in Amsterdam to investigate. They'll also be taking the wraps off rap music when Tracy McLeod presents The Late Show at 11:15. That's after our nightly analysis of world events. Newsnight.
Good evening. There are reports that China's leader Deng Xiaoping, having failed so far to persuade the army to quell the peaceful uprising in Peking, has now left the capital and is looking for support further south. The situation throughout the country remains very tense, and the crisis of paralysis within the leadership is unresolved. In Peking, there are reports of troops pushing their way through some students, but no sign of any combined movement against Tiananmen Square in the center. To help us interpret events tonight, we've Winston Lord, who's just completed his tour as US ambassador in Peking, Zhu Xiaoming, a leading Peking academic now studying in Glasgow, and David Shambar, the biographer of Zhao Ziyang, the man the students now look to take up their demands for democratic reform. Also tonight, the Tories published their recipe for Europe, the party's manifesto for next month's elections to the European Parliament. And the Prime Minister tells us she wants no bureaucratic meddling from Brussels. How does Labour's Brian Gould reckon his party can improve on that with its manifesto tomorrow? The Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir today presented to Mrs Thatcher his peace plan for the occupied territories. It's already been officially rejected by the PLO, but there's increasing evidence that the Palestinians want to amend Mr. Shamir's plan to make it work on their terms. The delicate balance in the streets of Peking between troops and students took a nervous jolt today when, at one point, soldiers were reported to have broken through a barricade. But that did not apparently signal the coordinated assault on the students that the leadership ordered on Saturday. The army's apparent refusal to put down the popular demonstrations has already discredited the Conservative Prime Minister Li Peng, who ordered them in. And the failure of martial law so far may have strengthened the hands of the reformers, led by the Communist Party chief Zhao Ziyang. The role of the army is now crucial. Reluctant though it may be to act, it is thought broadly to remain loyal to China's leader Deng Xiaoping. And Mr. Deng is reported to be in the city of Wuhan in central China, where he's seeking support from local military commanders. As Alenka Frenkel in London now reports, an attempt by China's veteran leader to ask troops outside Peking to put down the uprising could plunge the country into civil war.
Leaflets showered from army helicopters reassured protesters that troops would not be used in violence against them. But they urged the students to support the now vilified Prime Minister, hardliner Li Peng. And curiously, the leaflets listed anti-government slogans which, they reminded demonstrators, were not permitted. With the second dawn deadline passed and no military advance on Tiananmen Square, protesters saw the People's Army refuse to enforce Deng Xiaoping's orders of martial law and arbitrate against the people in this political power struggle.
The military are not entirely happy with Deng Xiaoping, by the way, because they have told him many times that he was opening a Pandora's box by introducing economic reforms. And they're well saying to him now, well, this is your mess, you created, we told you so. And now you're asking us to clean up the mess. Well, you should help clean the mess by agreeing to a political solution.
My own guess is that if martial law
fails to be implemented, then this will severely weaken the position of Li Peng, Deng Xiaoping and the hardliners in the Politburo. And then we may see Zhao Ziyang, who's been very absent, I may say, over the last 2 or 3 days, once again come to the fore at the head of the more liberal reformers in the Politburo.
Troops remain poised along the main roads into Peking, but tonight came the first unconfirmed reports of a clash as soldiers tried to break through blockades erected to keep them out of the city. One report said 15 were injured, but no shots were fired and no military vehicles advanced on the city centre. Exhaustion, hunger and infection is now spreading among the demonstrators, and some have headed home for a break, promising to return. But tens of thousands remain. One student leader said the demonstration would end if a pro-Deng editorial in the People's Daily condemning the students' action was retracted. But so far, confusion reigns as to who's in charge. An official spokesman asked today about rumours of resignations and reinstatements said, "I cannot tell you whether Zhao Ziyang is or is not General Secretary of the Communist Party."
I think that particularly confused answer from Chinese spokesmen is a fair indication that they themselves are very unsure and nobody's willing to commit themselves, because they could be in deep trouble if they say, for example, that Zhao is out, when in fact then tomorrow, who knows, Li Peng and Deng Xiaoping may fall and Zhao Ziyang may come back in storming glory. On the other hand, today I know that Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng were again named in their present posts. So I think there's huge confusion, and I think it's a very fair indication of the colossal infighting that's still going on in the Politburo itself and in the top leadership.
Deng Xiaoping, China's top man and another hardliner, was, it said, directly involved in the decision to impose martial law. The army's failure to enforce it reflects on him, and it said he's now trying to put that right. Faced with a stubborn military intransigence amounting to rebellion in Peking, matched by troops in Shanghai, where it's reported the city authorities refused to let him stay, he's now believed to have travelled south to his son's home in Wuhan, where he hopes to galvanise the support of the central and southern troops, less sympathetic than their Peking comrades to the students' calls for democracy.
Well, it's quite clear that he has not got the support of the commanders of the Peking military region. So it wouldn't surprise me if he has gone down to the centre of China to look for support in the Wuhan military region, and possibly even to his old base of support in the Canton military region in the far south. He might also be looking to the harder troops of the west, Tibet, Xinjiang. Now, these are more used to bashing the heads of dissenting Tibetans and Uyghur Muslims. Whether these crack troops would be quite so prepared to actually hit the heads or even put bullets into Han Chinese, their own Han Chinese in Peking, is quite another matter. But it's quite obvious that Deng is having to move around to galvanise support.
These reports are very disturbing, because if Deng Xiaoping is able to rally these troops, and these troops are sent up to Peking, and given the fact that the military commanders in Peking have stated that they will fight those people who fight the students by force, then we are on the verge of civil war.
But civil war is hard to envisage in a country whose 10-day protest against an intractable leadership has yet to shed a drop of blood. The students are confident their protests will succeed.
Me, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. Because no people are afraid of the force.
Tonight, perhaps, while China's leadership is divided and confused, the demonstrators have nothing to fear. The real test of their courage will come if the hardliners win this political power struggle and decide to crush this new generation of dissent.
Alenka Frenkel reporting. I'm joined now on the phone from Peking by our Foreign Affairs editor, John Simpson. John, first of all, the situation in Peking. How long do people expect the standoff there to continue?
Well, it's just continuing indefinitely. I don't think anybody's got any ideas whatever of timescales or anything. There's a sense of things fraying around the edge, undoubtedly. People living in absolute conditions of squalor in Tiananmen Square, surrounded by heaps of garbage, a terrible smell from just too many bodies in too small a place. There's the same thing in a much smaller scale is happening in little areas around the city where the army has been in place since, Saturday, Friday night, Saturday morning, and they can't move out of their trucks either, or their trains in one case. So there's a sense of sort of general stagnation of people just sitting around waiting for something to happen. But the interesting thing is that although the official media keep on stressing any sign that they can, that's to say the official media who support Li Peng and Deng Xiaoping, because there are other elements of it which don't, although they're stressing every little sign that students might be going home or getting bored with the whole thing, nevertheless the students themselves seem to manage to keep up a kind of revolutionary fervor which does guarantee that the thing won't simply go away immediately.
And John, this report of a clash between troops and some students at one barricade, just a hiccup or a sign of worse to come?
This seems to have been, I think, a little bit played up. That's the general opinion here. I think it was simply that some soldiers were getting hungry and tired and sick of things, and maybe some of them lashed out at some of the students. I don't think it really is necessarily a symbol of anything other than people's tiredness and dejection about the whole thing. In fact, it's been quite interesting. In some places, the students are quite solicitous about the soldiers, and if you go and try and film the soldiers, it's the students that come and put their hand in the lens and say, no, we've got an agreement with them that you're not allowed to come here and upset them. So I think there's a sort of symbiosis which operates in some of the places between students and soldiers.
John, thank you very much indeed. Well, now in the studio with me, David Shambar, who is from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Joining us from Glasgow, Zhu Xiaoming, who is a research fellow with the Glasgow University. He's an academic normally in Peking. And from New York, Winston Lord, who has just returned to America from Peking, where he was the American ambassador. Mr. Lord, first, what do you make of the situation tonight? Is it yet clear, do you think, that the Conservatives have lost this one, that the martial law effort has failed?
I think it's premature to reach that conclusion, but it seems to be possibly heading in that direction. What is clear is the longer term, and that is that China is going to be a freer society over time. How we get from here to there, whether there's a tragic interlude on the way, remains to be seen. But I agree with the analysis I've heard on your program that there's fraying at the edges on both sides. How long can Li Peng and the others declare martial law and not be able to exert their authority without losing face and control and perhaps having to be sacrificed? But then how long can the students hold out with the world media satellite television being reduced by the authorities, with the workers perhaps who have supported them having a different agenda, with probably factions developing among the students and general fatigue? So it's a very fluid, uncertain situation. I'm sure the longer run, in terms of political freedoms, they cannot go back. In the short run, I think Zhao Ziyang's chances look much better tonight than they did a couple of days ago.
Well, let's come to Zhao Ziyang in a moment, but first of all, Mr. Zhu Xiaoming, do you share that broad thought that on the whole the outlook, the long-term outlook is good, but in the short term, what do you think are the dangers?
It's very difficult to predict at the moment because people are very confused by what they have read and what they have heard. And to my mind, Mr. Zhao Ziyang's position has been strengthened, especially after the rumor said that he had offered his resignation.
That may be so, and indeed that was what Mr. Winston Lord was saying, but in the short term, before Mr. Zhao Ziyang is once again, in a sense, installed on the throne, before he's once again clearly there in command, and he's not there in command at the moment, what are the pitfalls, what are the things that could go sadly and seriously wrong before that situation is restored?
Yes, to me, I think this is something, a political gambling. If he's waiting for something, if the hardliners of the government fails in cracking down the demonstration, I think he would come out with a stronger position.
Right. David Shambar, the reports we're hearing tonight about Deng Xiaoping being down in Wuhan, you heard Cyril Lin there talking about the dangers of civil war. How seriously do you take that?
Well, I think the dangers of civil war are unfortunately real. They're going to be more real if indeed force is employed. But my view of this is that the use of force is no longer the key issue being debated at the top level, but indeed they've already lost credibility by not having imposed it over the last 2 days. The issue is really what a reconstituted Chinese government and party leadership is going to be in terms of personnel and in terms of the package of accommodations that they will have to arrive at with the demonstrators. So Deng's leaving the capital is a tactic that Chinese rulers have frequently used in the past. Mao was, for example, known to do that frequently. And it's the safest thing he could have done.
Yeah, but has he gone down south to raise an army to march north with? I mean, is it as simple and as primitive as that?
I don't think so. I think that's an incorrect analysis.
Well, then, is there a danger of him trying to stir up some of the... Mr. Lord, what do you think? Is there a danger, indeed, is there a possibility that Deng does still command such loyalty in the army, particularly outside Peking, that he could cause part of it to march against another part?
It's conceivable, but Deng does not have the authority he once had. It's much more of a collective decision-making process, including in the military. It's already been clear in recent weeks that they couldn't count on the garrisons around Beijing. They've already brought in some troops from other provinces. Furthermore, no matter how many troops they assemble, if you turn out 1 million people of all sectors of society blocking those troops, there's going to be terrible bloodshed. So I'd like to think they would shrink back from that. And I'm not sure it's at all clear that Deng is down there rallying the troops, as Mr. Schönborn said. I think he may be distancing himself. He may sacrifice Li Peng. You cannot predict what's going to happen. Although his instincts certainly are with Li Peng. He's conservative on the political front, even as he has been, of course, very progressive on the economic front. And I think at this time when it's fashionable to kick around Deng, we do have to recall and acknowledge his great achievements in bringing China back from the Cultural Revolution, the opening to the outside, and the great lifting of the standards of living.
Well, indeed,
the tragedy, personally, for him is that he has not been able to carry them forward on the political front. He's just too old now and temperamentally not suited to that.
Well, indeed, his refusal to contemplate political reform. And what do you think, Mr. Zhu? There's Mr. Deng down there in Wuhan, perhaps appealing for support from army units down there. Do you think there's a serious possibility, as Cyril Lind was saying a bit earlier, that he might succeed in actually getting them to oppose the other units in the army further north?
I don't think so. It's still the possibility of cracking down the demonstration still exists. But I don't think if he is trying to do that, I think the civil war might occur. So that is a real tragedy for the Chinese people and the government.
David Schönborn, let's now look at Zhao Ziyang. Let's take what you've all been saying is the longer-term prospect of Zhao Ziyang being the man whose star is clearly in the ascendant. I mean, he didn't sign the martial law decree, as it were. He didn't send the troops in. He's the one who may be vindicated by this weekend. What is he going to be able to promise the students, and what is going to be the ultimate outturn in terms of democracy in China?
Well, he promises, first of all, the only conciliatory person in the leadership that can put the lid back on this thing. Secondly, he can promise the outside world continuity in the foreign policy directions that the Chinese leadership has been following for the last decade. And in terms of a package of accommodations he can promise, Zhao is not a leader who believes in a penetrating party that will dominate society, but indeed one that is removed from society. He believes very much in the entrepreneurial spirit of the Chinese people, particularly the peasants. And it is important to note that Zhao is not a liberal Democrat in the Western sense of the term at all, but he has shown proclivities throughout his career not only for freer debate within the leadership, but indeed within society at large. China's first pro-democracy demonstration took place in 1973 in Canton when Zhao was the then provincial chief. He permitted it to go on at that time. So I see him as doing several things. First of all, briefly, instituting a system where the National People's Congress becomes a more realistic parliament, perhaps with multiple slate elections to it, the rule of law.
Multiple slate, multi-party?
No, multiple candidates.
Right.
Perhaps trying to strengthen some of these so-called democratic parties that exist in society. He would give the press much greater freedom to act as a watchdog upon government. And finally, I believe that he would continue his policies for economic reform.
Mr. Lord, set that, if you would, that picture that David was painting there, that picture of the sort of democracy we expect to see in China against Mr. Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union. What sort of democracy do you think we're talking about in China?
Well, I think what has just been described is a very accurate prediction of what might happen under Zhejiang. By the way, I would add that he's got a lot of allies in the provinces. He's been in the southern provinces, he's been in Sichuan as party and provincial leaders, so he's got a lot of allies around the country, which also helps him politically at this moment. I think the key step next in terms of political freedoms, and which the students and others have been asking for in very reasonable terms. They haven't projected British or American-style multi-party democracy. They know that's unrealistic in the short run. Their demands have been reasonable. I think it's a process, namely some dialogue between the government and some independent associations, not competing parties, but elected student unions, perhaps others, that can carry on as a vehicle for some dissent and for some dialogue with the government. That's sort of the key way to diffuse this situation, and that's the first gesture he can make, along with a freer press. Anti-corruption will be in there, I think, and the other illustrations that your correspondent just mentioned, the biographer just mentioned.
And Mr. Zhu, what do you think we're talking about again now in terms of timescale? If, and of course it's a big if, but all three of you seem to accept that it's a probability that Zhejiang will be in charge soon. How long do you think he has to put into effect a reform that will stick before others start saying that he's got it wrong again and others will start moving in on him?
Mm-hmm. I think there are many things for people to do in China. And the first, for the political reform and the freedom of speech and the freedom of press, it seems to me that is very important. And then the genuine election of the People's Congress, the deputies for the People's Congress. And I think these are the two basic things for the Chinese people and the Chinese government can do at the moment.
And how long will that take, and how long has he got to prove he can do it?
It maybe take 1 or 2 years to do that. And I think within the under the law, under the Constitution.
Right, Mr. Zhu Xiaoming, thank you very much indeed. Winston Lord, David Shambar, thank you very much all of you for joining us. Meddlesome bureaucracy, socialism imposed from Brussels. That's the Europe the Prime Minister promises to protect Britain from in her Conservative manifesto for the European elections launched today. She shows no sign of toning down her own outspoken attitude to Europe after a week of open division within the Tory party. A rows between her government and the Brussels Commission over health regulations, the proposed new workers' charter and language teaching in schools. The Conservative manifesto pledges a continuing fight against what it sees as bureaucracy. Saying that Conservatives have led Europe in economic deregulation, it calls for greater liberalisation in financial services, transport and frontier controls, but tight policing of immigration controls and drug checks. New measures to combat community fraud are called for, and closer scrutiny of the common agricultural policy. On tax harmonisation, the manifesto says there will be no need to standardise sales taxes. On social and industrial relations, the manifesto says each country should determine its own policies. Well, this morning, the BBC's political editor John Cole spoke to Mrs Thatcher about the two areas that appear to worry Conservatives most: the Delors report on closer economic union and the Workers' Charter. And he asked the Prime Minister why the government was so opposed to Brussels attempting to legislate in the field of social policy.
I think the Commission is trying to take extra authority unto itself, and I think we're quite right to say that you do not take as much to the centre as you can. You take as much to the periphery as you can, preferably by people making their own decisions, but otherwise you have regard to the traditions and customs in each country. They do, you know. They do on the continent. They watch very carefully that we don't impose things upon them, and they must similarly watch that they don't impose things on us. And my job is to fight Britain's corner with a commitment to a larger common market. I'm quite prepared to do that. Indeed, it would be in our interest, but I'm not prepared to have needless, petty bureaucracy imposed on us. We British don't like to be pushed around.
Do you consider you're going to have a very big battle on that? I mean, could it lead to a break?
No, I'm not going to have a great big battle on it. If you looked at the debate on Thursday night in the House of Commons, Francis Maude, in winding up, gave examples of where other people are absolutely against certain parts parts of the proposals that are being brought before. I don't understand why you think it's so wrong for Britain to stand up to herself and so right for other countries to do. You don't really want a government fighting in Europe that's soft and soggy and a pushover. We're none of those things, and we shall fight for our corner in Europe.
Now, turning to the exchange rate mechanism, you have consistently said, and the government has said, that you will join when the time is right, but people are saying that that means never. Could you define the kind of conditions when you think we would go in?
No, I would not say it means never, that the policy is the same as it has been. But just look, at the moment, we are a much freer economy than some of those who belong to the exchange rate mechanism. For example, we have free movement of capital. That's why we have a lot of factories coming here. We don't have any foreign exchange control. Now, some of them manage to stay in that system because they don't have free movement of capital, because they haven't got rid of foreign exchange control. Now, we're not going to have those extra things put upon us in any way.
It's been widely reported that these matters, ERM particularly, have put heavy strains on your relationship with the Foreign Secretary and indeed with the Chancellor. How would you define that relationship?
No, they haven't at all. I don't know of anyone who suggests that we should consider going to the exchange rate mechanism first until we've tackled the inflation, because inflation is a monetary phenomenon and you simply can't be constrained by giving up the right to have that authority yourself. And I don't know of anyone who suggests that we do that until Europe is as free as we are with regard to capital movements and foreign exchange control. After all, that is right in the heart of the European Treaty. We are ahead of some other countries in Europe in implementing the real treaty, not in the petty bureaucracy like what you put on cigarette packets. That's ridiculous.
Well, that was the Prime Minister earlier today, and now I'm joined by Labour's European Campaign Coordinator, Brian Gould. Brian Gould, would you accept that British people are likely to be impressed by the Prime Minister promising to fight Britain's corner like she is?
Well, they may or may not be impressed by that, by what she says, but I think if they look at the record, they'll be much less impressed. Because although Mrs. Thatcher constantly says how tough she's going to be, and indeed she does use the language which antagonises everybody in Europe.
She's been no pushover, has she?
Oh yes, the truth of the matter is that she's given way. All the things that she now says she's going to fight to the last ditch to protect, she signed away some years ago. It was her government and Mrs. Thatcher who forced through the Single European Act on a guillotine, on a three-line whip. It was Mrs. Thatcher who signed the Stuttgart Declaration. She did it all herself 2 or 3 years ago. It's a bit late in the day now for her to change her mind or to say that somehow or another she got it wrong. I wish if she'd been so keen to protect our interests that she would actually do something now to help British industry prepare for what she's let us in for, which is a great single European market in which we are woefully ill-prepared because her government won't take the action which other comparable governments are taking.
Right, now your party opposed the Single European Act. Your party, indeed, as recently as 1983, was for withdrawing from the community. Your election manifesto at the last election but one. What are you offering the British people now? I mean, she, after all, is saying, look, we want Europe, but we're no pushover. What are you saying?
Well, as I say, I think that she may say that, but that's not her record. We, on the other hand, are saying very clearly that there are major challenges that we have to face if we're to go into a single European market after 1992. British industry desperately needs investment, it desperately needs government help to prepare for that market. In other words, Mrs. Thatcher has left us too economically weak to meet those challenges. On the other hand...
Are you enthusiastic about that market? Are you enthusiastic about that single market?
It's going to happen. It's a major opportunity for us.
A good thing.
But, yes, a good thing, but fraught with dangers, and unless we're better prepared, much of British industry is going to be fighting for survival rather than taking advantage of those great opportunities. But let me also say, for the same ideological reasons as she will not intervene to help British industry, she will not intervene either to take advantage of the great social agenda, the environmental cooperation which is now being offered. In other words, we're too socially backward under Mrs. Thatcher to take advantage of the opportunities that arise. So, too economically weak, too socially backward to meet the challenges or take the opportunities. That's our charge, and that's the agenda we place before ourselves and before the nation. That's the agenda we should be addressing.
But do you accept, are you with her on what she calls the meddlesome bureaucracy? Do you think it's essential that the whole point of this great single European market is that you mustn't put controls and regulations and allow the bureaucrats to get hold of you. You allow yourself the freedom to exploit that market.
Well, of course, no one likes to be seen to be approving of bureaucracy, and of course that's a very tendentious way of putting it anyway. But Mrs. Thatcher, let's be quite clear, is opposed to government. She's opposed to government intervention in the market wherever it occurs. Now, that's not our position. Our position is, yes, there are certain interventions by governments which are best done at the European level. If you want to control pollution, you have to do it multinationally because pollution knows no national boundaries. On the other hand, we're also very clear that we need intervention at the level of the nation state as well if we're properly to protect our national interests. So we have a much more sophisticated position, I believe, than Mrs. Thatcher or her, by now, dreadfully divided Conservative Party. We see the need for government intervention at the appropriate level according to which function is being exercised. And that's why we now support a level of European activity by governments which I believe can produce great benefits for us.
Brian Gould, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now a look at some of today's other main news stories. Britain and the Soviet Union have been involved in angry exchanges today after this weekend's tit-for-tat expulsions. This began on Friday when 11 Russians were expelled from Britain over spying allegations. David Loyne reports.
Sir Geoffrey Howe warned the KGB in public last January. With the warnings apparently ignored, the government acted.
It reveals that perhaps the Soviet Union has changed rather less than a number of other people had hoped. We had hoped that it ushered in a new era. It indicates that many of the things are still the same. And I'm disappointed, but we gave them the chance. They have not taken it, and they've revealed their true nature.
In the Commons, Labour accused the government of incompetence in the handling of the issue, and later Labour's shadow Foreign Secretary found an ulterior motive in the timing of the expulsions.
It seems to me that it can't be a coincidence that this is being done the week before the NATO summit in Brussels, when all the rest of NATO is now ready to negotiate with the Soviets, that only Britain isn't, and that it therefore suits the British government to whip up a bit of Cold War hysteria.
The Soviet response has been swift. 11 diplomats and journalists ordered out in direct retaliation, and they've gone further. In Moscow, Gennady Gerasimov said up to 170 British citizens who live in the Soviet Union are to be asked to leave, to bring their number down to the quota of Soviet citizens allowed to live in Britain. After the 11 leave from each side, it's not clear when or how the Soviet Union will carry out their threat of asking 170 more Britons to leave.
The Public Employees Union NUPE has voted to back Labour's new multilateralist defence policy. At their annual conference in Scarborough today, the union changed its stance on defence, which for the past 10 years has been firmly unilateralist. The result significantly improves Neil Kinnock's chances of having his defence review approved at Labour's annual conference in October. The government's appointed a team of industrialists to help run the National Health Service. But the inclusion on the new NHS policy board of Rover chairman Sir Graham Day and British Steel chairman Sir Robert Scoley has provoked controversy. Both men have been involved in the privatisation of British industries. Voters in the constituencies of Vauxhall and Glasgow Central will go to the polls on June the 15th, the same day as the European elections. The writs for both by-elections were moved in the House of Commons today. In Japan, 2 members of parliament have been charged with accepting bribes from the company Recruit in the corruption scandal which has led to the resignation of the Japanese Prime Minister, Noboru Takeshita. One of those charged, Mr. Takao Fujinami, is a former chief cabinet secretary. There are new problems for the satellite TV industry today, with the announcement from BSB, due to become Britain's second satellite station, that its launch will be postponed by at least 2 months. But some experts believe the delay may be up to a year. Already sales of receiver dishes for Sky Television, BSB's main rival, are being described as disappointing. And now, the American Secretary of State, Mr. James Baker, has tonight delivered one of the toughest messages to Israel ever to come from an American government. In a speech to pro-Israel lobbyists in Washington, Mr. Baker told Israel to lay aside the unrealistic vision of a greater Israel.
Forswear annexation. Stop settlement activity. Allow schools to reopen. Reach out to the Palestinians as neighbors who deserve political rights.
Meanwhile, at Downing Street, Mrs. Thatcher has been adding her pressure. As the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir presented his peace plan in person, the Prime Minister made clear Britain's view of his plan's shortcomings. And she stressed the importance of clear promise from Israel of progress towards negotiations and a solution based on territory for peace, something Mr. Shamir has so far rejected. Julian O'Halloran now reports on the growing pressures on Mr. Shamir from all sides.
In North London, a group of British Jews who take a very different political line from the Israeli Prime Minister were gathering as Mr. Shamir flew to London. At Hampstead Town Hall, the British Friends of Peace Now were holding their annual meeting. But this year, there was something new, something that even this dovish group would not have countenanced in years gone by.
And our third speaker will be Karma Nabulsi, Deputy Representative of the Palestine Liberation Organization in the UK.
There was a warm welcome for a speaker who would a year ago have been excluded as being a member of a terrorist organization. But that was before the PLO renounced the armed struggle and the implied aim of destroying Israel.
A couple of days ago I was in Scotland, and when Mr. Zucker was summing up, we spoke to the Jewish community. He said something like, I think you have to acknowledge that here is a human being, because I'm a PLO official. And everybody started applauding, that I was a human being.
The problem for Karma Nabulsi and the Palestinians is that this audience, committed to dialogue with the PLO, appears to reflect only a minority of opinion in Israel. Indeed, the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Shamir, has, in the new peace plan he's brought to London, gone out of his way to say that Israel will not talk to the PLO. As Mr. Shamir prepared with his team for the Downing Street talks today, the most obvious feature of his plan was, in contrast, its attempt to create a body of Palestinians with whom Israel could negotiate, but who would have no formal links with the PLO. The Shamir Peace Initiative proposes what it calls free and democratic elections in the occupied territories, the West Bank and Gaza. In these, Palestinians would elect a team of representatives to negotiate with Israel for a 5-year transitional period of self-rule. Jordan and Egypt, as well as the elected Palestinians, would also be invited to the talks, and later to negotiate a permanent solution. Yet the plan states clearly that Israel opposes a Palestinian state.
This is the first time that we are giving the Palestinians, through a process of free and democratic election, the possibility to choose their representative and their leadership. And this is why I think they should jump on this occasion and not miss that occasion like they have missed so many in the past.
But some Palestinians who've suffered the effects of their own uprising are not in a mood to buy the plan, at least in the form it's presented. The case of 21-year-old Raji Bara, now in a hospital room in Westminster, illustrates the defiant mood. Bara has lost a leg, has no feeling in the other, and has a badly damaged arm after being shot by Israeli soldiers during an argument when they entered his home in the West Bank looking for the killer of an Israeli soldier.
He pushed the 3 soldiers, and one soldier shot him 6 bullets into him. And after that, the ambulance came to help him to go to hospital. The Israelis is not allowed the ambulance to help him.
Despite his appalling injuries, Bara told us he'd like to go back to take part in the Palestinian struggle. The uprising, almost 18 months old, which has claimed nearly 500 Palestinian and 22 Israeli lives, is now at a critical turning point and shows alarming signs of escalating. Among those accused of organizing the Palestinian campaign is a leading academic, Dr. Sari Nusseibeh. He denies this and says Mr. Shamir's peace move is a trick to end the uprising or intifada.
Well, in my view, Mr. Shamir's peace offer is not really genuine. What he wishes to do is basically to try and give Israel a cover, an international cover, a public relations cover, a public image kind of cover, for what Israel really wants to pursue and seriously wants to pursue, which is simply the crushing of the intifada.
There's been no voting in the occupied territories since 1976, when in the West Bank a municipal election campaign produced Palestinian leaders who in the end failed Israel's criteria of moderation. Hardly any are left in office. The former mayor of Hebron, Mustafa Nach, is mistrustful of the new election plan because of what happened to those elected in 1976.
Some of us were deported, some of us were dismissed, and many of us were under city arrest. We can't make political meetings, we can't make press conferences. Any kind of democracy is prevented for the elected mayors and councillors.
But it's in the Israeli parliament that Mr. Shamir faces the most dangerous criticism. Hawks in his own party, Likud, say the peace plan will lead to a Palestinian state, and they may challenge his leadership. But leaders of the Peace Now movement, like Dedi Zucker, not normally friends of Mr. Shamir, say his initiative, while hardly a plan, is better than nothing.
I have no doubt Shamir is one of these Israelis that the last 18 months of intifada, of uprising, was a very clear proof to them that the occupation doesn't work, that we cannot rule over the Palestinian people with no price. And he's a prime minister, and he feels that the price that we are paying, mainly the army and the Israeli economy, is a very high price. And he's really trying to start a process. Nobody knows where does this process leads to. Neither does Shamir know. But he's generally trying to do something.
In London, Palestinians picketing the Israeli embassy appear to disagree. But despite their slogans, PLO rejection of the peace plan is not total. They just want it radically changed. For instance, there's no mention in it of a vote for Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, though a scheme has been informally floated that they might be allowed to vote elsewhere.
I personally believe that this is an insult to me as a Jerusalemite and as a Muslim, as well as being a Palestinian who lives in Jerusalem and who's been living in Jerusalem for thousands of years. East Jerusalem is part and parcel of the West Bank. We believe that East Jerusalem must be the capital of a Palestinian state. We are prepared to accept all kinds of other arrangements, like an open border city between the two parts of the capital. We are so that we will have two capitals. We are prepared to negotiate everything, but East Jerusalem, in terms of sovereignty, in terms of the future, must be and cannot but be a capital of our Palestinian state.
Mr. Shamir will also have heard from Mrs. Thatcher tonight a number of other queries about gaps in his peace plan. Despite the smiles, Britain regards it as a first step which doesn't yet get the Israelis near to a solution. But the growing momentum of violence in the occupied territories, with children and civilians being injured or killed in greater numbers, may just be checked by the counterweight of rising international pressure on the Israelis and Palestinians to end the bloodletting and talk.
Julian O'Halloran reporting. And now the business news. There's more pressure on the Chancellor tonight to raise interest rates after heavy losses by the pound against other major currencies. Against the dollar, the pound fell by over 3.5 cents, closing in New York at $1.5750. Against the Deutschmark, it was down by over 1.5 pfennigs, ending at 3.1696.
The run on the pound was a delayed reaction to last Friday's news that inflation had reached 8%. There were signs yesterday as well of the knock-on effect on pay settlements. Power workers were offered a wage rise of over 9%. Some British companies want the pound to fall. It makes their products look cheaper to buyers overseas. But ironically, a weak pound can also cause higher inflation.
The government doesn't actually need it to be easier for exporters and businesses that are competing with imports, because in order to persuade business to keep costs down, and in particular to keep wage costs down, then it mustn't be comfortable for businesses. They need to suffer some pain.
The city wants the government to push interest rates even higher than their present 13%.
I think myself that the situation is so serious that they ought to put interest rates up to 15% rather than 14%.
The Chancellor has promised he'll raise the cost of borrowing if it's necessary to fight inflation. However, the Prime Minister's economic policy advisor, Professor Alan Walters, is thought to have told Mrs Thatcher that interest rates are high enough. The test for Mr Lawson will be on Thursday if the latest set of trade figures show another big deficit. That could result in more heavy falls for the pound and show whether the government can stomach higher interest rates.
And those worries about a possible rise in interest rates following the pound's fall depressed share prices. In a day of heavy selling, the 100 index dropped sharply, closing at 21.69, down 35 points. In New York, the dollar's rise didn't excite the stock market. The Dow Jones ended at 25.02, up just 1 point. The Australian businessman, Alan Bond, has sold nearly half his shares in the British food and drinks group Allied Lions. The £143 million raised will help reduce the troubled Bond Corporation's debts. The Trade Secretary, Lord Young, has been told by Toyota that Britain is the prime candidate for its new European car engine plant. Lord Young was visiting Toyota's car factory in Japan. The company has already chosen Derbyshire for its European assembly plant. The electronics group Plessey, which is trying to fight off a joint takeover bid from West Germany's Siemens and Britain's GEC, today announced record profits. Last year, Plessey made over £195 million, up 14% on the previous year.
The record results are just what Plessey needs as it faces the prospect of a new and possibly higher offer from the GEC Siemens consortium. Plessey's results highlight its own takeovers and rapid growth in the semiconductor and telecommunications industry, including GPT, its joint venture with GEC, which accounts for a third of its turnover. Plessey claims today's results mean the company is worth a lot more than the original consortium offer of 225p a share.
Key factors which one must take into account. Value of GPT. I think the strong results that we announced today, important. Improvement of the stock market over the course of the last 6 months since this bid was originally started, and discussions we've had with our shareholders about the important strategic value of many of our businesses must give you an answer which is well in excess of £3 a share.
The original bid of £1.8 billion has lapsed until the Ministry of Defence finishes investigating the national security implications of a takeover. Its ruling is due out next week. Then GEC and Siemens will decide whether to join battle to bid again for Plessey, and at what price.
And the financial news is big billing in the morning papers. The Daily Telegraph has pounded inflation under pressure. The Financial Times, too, talks about international stability, the G7 accord being jeopardized by the currency instability. Power vacuum in Peking, The Independent. The Times, Moscow curb on the Britons in expulsion row, the news that a lot of diplomats and others in Moscow are not going to be able to stay. The Guardian, Russia cuts UK quota in Moscow. Icy blast from the Kremlin, the Daily Mail. The Sun has 5 pence a mile on private motorways. Frustrated motorists, it says, will soon be able to dodge traffic jams on 5 pence a mile private motorways. And the Daily Mirror, finally, Rob Lowe's rude video. If you want to read about steamy segments of a porn video, you want to buy the Mirror tomorrow morning. Well, the weather, finally, it'll again be hot and humid over much of the country tomorrow, but rain may spread from the west later in the day. And that's all from Newsnight tonight. Back tomorrow at our usual time of 10:30. But for the moment, for myself and all those on the programme, good night.
In 10 minutes on BBC One Mediterranean Cookery, Claudia Roden looks at the cuisine that's developed in Istanbul over 500 years of Ottoman rule. Viewers in Scotland and Northern Ireland can see it later. Viewers to BBC Two, wherever they live, can now see The Late Show.